All right. Okay, extra chair needed for this one. The next topic we're going to be talking about is business identity. We have touched on it this morning, the area of how we authenticate a business that's trying to get in touch with a customer. Comes to the heart of everything we're talking about really today. So I'd like to welcome on stage John Bruner, who's the CEO of Aegis Mobile. Very enthusiastically supported by Susan there. Dr. Marco Lafrentz, who's the VP of Business and Market Development at netnumber. Thank you, Marco. And our own Michael Round, who's the Project Director of MEF. Okay, so business identity. What we're really talking about is the ability to differentiate between genuine and fraudulent suppliers. So, John, I think the best way to really kick this off is to, this is the heart of what you do. Tell me about why you started the company and, how you spotted that this was a problem that needed to be solved and how you went about solving it.
That's an interesting question. I actually didn't start Aegis. Aegis was started 17 years ago. Yeah. So what actually was interesting is Aegis has been a vetting authority for many carrier channels for about 17 years now. It all started with premium SMS and the fact that we would shut down bad actors on Friday, and by the next Thursday they had created a new company and were registering to come back in and cram charges again. And so we realized that we had to develop very sophisticated identity capabilities, but also relational analytics so that we could tie bad actors together and prevent the whack-a-mole scenario when they come back. But in the messaging industry, we were asked to come back to that industry about 2 years ago when we were asked to bring kind of innovation technology and more competitive pricing to the market. And so we developed a completely automated API-based identity verification and behavioral vetting platform that has scaled very well. We've hit 2 million transactions over the last 14 months. So that's kind of the history of how we got here.
Okay,
that answers the question.
We'll come back to how you verify these organizations. Marco, what about you? What's netnumber's kind of role in detecting and protecting against some of these fraudulent suppliers?
That's a very good point. We had two speakers today that sort of helped me make an introduction. One was from Google, who said that business verification, business vetting, is actually successfully combating negative messages, negative experiences, and protecting against fraud on their network. And then I think it was Vodafone who said that, well, in theory, if we would have all of the data available when making a decision on a message or a voice call, whether we should be terminating that or not, if we would have all of the data available, we could potentially combat 100% of the fraud, but we don't have the data available. Now, what netnumber is doing, and our role in that ecosystem, is that when there are parties, for example, hiring John Bruner's company to vet entities, like might that be a CPaaS player, CSP, but also carrier, or large corporations themselves. And they do have a vetted enterprise, and they do have a lot of data around this enterprise, this brand. It needs to be usable for the telecommunications industry, and it needs to be made available. So it needs to be linked with a phone number, because that's the thing that you see. You have the content, and you have the phone number for messaging, for example. That's also what you'll be doing. You link the brands and the merchants that you're dealing with to the communication. And that data then needs to be made available to the industry in a format that they can consume, right? Because if you want to actually protect the ecosystem, the cost of fighting it has to be low. So you need to have very good, scalable, cost-effective ways to distribute the intelligence that is needed to combat fraud. And this is what netnumber is doing.
And Mike, I know you're specifically here to talk about, sender ID and some of the programs that the MEF has done. But again, what prompted the MEF to address this particular problem, and how did you go about addressing it?
Well, MEF were asked as a part of an industry collaboration, and it's, I run the SMS protection registry on behalf of industry with my team who are here today. But it is important to say it's a collaboration from all the players, really. And it was that coming together probably about 5 years ago that MEF started to get involved, really, because the issues of smishing were becoming very apparent, and we were asked to put forward a proof of concept and some processes to try and significantly reduce that, which is what we did. And I think that's our contribution to business identity, really, is helping the merchants who use the registry protect their brands. SMS messages go out with their brand name on it, be it a bank or a utility company or whatever. And if fraudsters are going to spoof that or impersonate that, then clearly that's a massive problem. So what we've been doing, say over the last 5 years now in the UK, Spain and Ireland, is to help brands protect their digital identity. But it's interesting that we still have an education process, really. A lot of brands don't realise that they've got a digital identity to protect. And even some of the merchants or government agencies who you'd have thought would be, begging for this type of solution, don't necessarily get their arms around it. We have instances where people will say, well, I don't send out any text messages to consumers, so why would I want to be part of your registry? And the answer is quite simply that just because you don't doesn't say the fraudsters aren't, and you need to control your identity.
Can you give us some data on the number of the extent to which you think you might have mitigated the problem, or how many signatures you've got? Or?
So we started the project with 10 merchants in the UK. We've now got 40 major merchants. A lot of those are government agencies as well, but we actually cover nearly 200 brands. So it's quite widespread. And I think it's one of those things that's very difficult to quantify about how successful this is. Yeah. But I would say that when we started doing this, it was very, very easy for fraudsters to spoof a major brand's name, and that's what they were doing. So with the action that we took with protected sender IDs, that made life more difficult for the fraudsters. So what they started to do was to use a misspelt version of the sender ID, which is not such a great risk because it's not going to put it into a conversation thread on your phone. It's still pretty bad. But we've seen the fraud go from spoofing to impersonation, and now in the UK, a large majority, I would say, of the issues are actually on A2P messaging with SIMs rather than alphas. Right. I would take that as a success criteria, that we've moved the problem on. It hasn't gone away, but it's.
And you're in Ireland and Spain and the UK now, is that right?
Yeah, we've got a registry in Spain that Yolanda looks after, and one in Ireland. And we're looking to move the same thing, to cookie cut it and move it into other areas as well.
Okay.
So, if I may, the interesting thing, though, that we did in the U.S. market is we realized that you really can't stop fraud unless you know every single business sender that's in the market. And so the reality is that we can put branded messaging on banks, for example. And yeah, you're helping to protect the bank, but the reality is the fraudsters can still register a number in other places. There are other channels to send messages from, and they can still impersonate banks. So what we did in the US with a partner, the campaign registry, is we set up a high volume, low cost process to which every business in the country that wants to send messages to their customers has to be registered. That means we have traceback to that sender. And with the integration of OEM complaint reporting, which we're seeing tens of millions of complaints, some of them false positives, but some are real. We see a phone number that originated a message coming in from Apple. We know exactly in the registry, because netnumber enabled that phone number, The registry helps to tie a campaign to a phone number, to a brand, to us, and we can go into netnumber and shut that phone number off immediately. So the thought is that you create a low-cost, high-volume, very quick process where you create true identity of every business in your country that wants to do A2P messaging. And then you have absolute control over their messaging capabilities.
Yeah. One thing that I would like to add to that point, to also answer your question of scale, right? You said that the introduction of the registry actually made spoofing not worthwhile anymore. It has gone away, at least for the brands that you're protecting, not in general.
It's gone away, it's reduced.
All right. In North American market, the ecosystem has said spoofing is not a problem. And one of the reasons why this is not a problem is because there are over 200 million phone numbers, telephone numbers registered with the netnumber services registry that are eligible for business texting, right? And there are more properties around these phone numbers that allow the carriers to correctly police the networks and to make sure that spoofing is not an issue, right? So you have a few merchants, a few hundred brands, and in the North American market, we have put that at scale with vetting all of the senders. There are millions, and then also correlating them to millions of phone numbers and registering that and making that available to the ecosystem so they can act on that information.
So obviously numbers are one, usually accurate marker of a business's true identity. But I know, John, that you work with a whole bunch of other signals. Can you talk about what some of those are?
Whole bunch. Can you define signals?
The people who work at the organisation, and the history, reputation, those kinds of things.
Are you talking about vetting companies? Sorry.
Verifying their identity.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So there's all kinds of levels of verification of identity too, right? So, you can take things as simple as, do I have a valid business that legally exists in the country that it's from? Okay, great. I've got a real company. But have I reached out to that company in an automated way to verify they are who they say they are, which can also be done. But then if you want to do high volume messaging, you want to really, be like a government entity or a Fortune 500 company with high volume messaging, we're going to make sure that you are in fact, a government entity, that you are in fact a Fortune 500 company. But if you're a mid-sized company, we're going to look at your behavioral history. So we want to know if you've got any consumer fraud in your history as a company. Is there anything legally in your background, or criminally in your background, or financially in your background? Are there any key employees within your company that make key decisions that we know have had bad behavior in their history? So we literally go through about 80 data sources to do a behavioral analysis on these companies that want to do high volume messaging that aren't recognized Fortune 500 companies, to make sure up front that they're not going to come in and start doing harm. Now, is this 100% correct? No, but as I said, we had other channels that are in place, other things that we're working to create better communication, such as collecting, the Apple or Google, complaint data, and then tying that back to a registered number and being able to shut it down. But then also, how do we share that back with the aggregators so that they can actually take action to not let those brands come back in? So we're working on initiatives to actually, and working with Proofpoint and ENEA who are there. Here, how do we communicate back and forth with them, with the data, the bad actors, so that they can actually provide better filtering, but also how do they provide information back to the registry and netnumber to define that we've seen bad behavior from this phone number. So it's not that, and I think Ian is here, he was just on stage, has said vetting doesn't solve every problem, but it certainly does create a barrier to entry for bad actors. But at the same time, you don't want that barrier to be so strong that Bob's Barbershop isn't going to register, so that they have messages that we know who it's coming from.
Marco, how do you ensure that you don't make mistakes that damage legitimate businesses with your number identification process?
I think one of the important factors here around it is that there is an ecosystem of trusted parties. Right? So there are people that are eligible to share data and to know the data that is related around fraud. I think this is extremely important, right? So the customers and partners that we work with, they run networks, they run messaging platforms, they have a lot of traffic, right? And whenever they carry traffic, they have to make a lot of decisions around, should I actually terminate that message, yes or no? But it starts before that, saying, should I onboard that customer, yes or no, right? And on our side, when entries are made into the registry where our customers that we have like contracts with, that we know very well, that we have worked with for a very long time, that are carriers, tier 1s, tier 2s, aggregators, etc. And they say, I want to put this phone number in here. We have policies in place that make sure that it has been checked that whoever is going to use that phone number actually is on control of that phone number. And that's one of the reasons why spoofing is not an issue, right? Because it is checked each and every time that if a phone number is registered, whoever is doing the registration has checked, I know that customer, I know who this is, and then we also make sure that it's checked that the ownership of the phone number is there as well.
How do you integrate some of these identity solutions with other anti-fraud technologies in the network? Okay.
Yeah. I think the power in that is to be technologically very flexible. So many people think about these things as just databases, right? So there is a database, I can connect to the database, and then it's there. But it's not that simple, right? So we have to make this data available from like carrier routing systems that have 10,000 TPS, response times of 1 to 2 milliseconds on the one hand, but also make that available to like analysis engines that look at the messages and the traffics after the fact, right? So they had user complaints. So now they needed to start an investigation, and they have completely different requirements. And I think the magic here is to provide solutions to both of them in a way that they can process that technologically, but also commercially.
You know, I would add, I talked about the campaign registry in the United States. They're actually integrated with over 1,000 aggregators in the US market and all the tier 1 aggregators. So there's data passing between aggregators to the registry, but they're also integrated to the carriers, and the carriers have portals. They're integrated with all of us as well, and so we've created essentially a communications hub, if you will. And like I said, we are working to integrate with the firewall companies. We're working to provide more bad actor messaging data to the firewalls, but also looking to get the firewalls to give us more data that they discover. Because honestly, you know, fraud is going to happen. It will evolve. But we have put backstops, and we're working to put backstops in so many different parts of the life cycle of this business. If we can get it communicating, yes, it'll happen, but we can shut it down fast, right? And it's kind of like cybersecurity. If you're in cybersecurity, you're going to get hacked someday. They're going to get in. The question is, how long are they in, and how much damage do they do? And so by connecting and creating our communication hubs and our ability to interact with each other, it's the same thing as fighting cybercrime.
But it's actually not only just the telecommunications ecosystem, to be fair, right? Yes, we provide the data to the firewalls, to the messaging hubs, to the aggregators, to the carriers, but we also provide this to the insurances, to the financial institutions, because they're not part of the communication path, right? But still, they're supposed to transact, for example, money or anything of value. So they also have very sophisticated data analytics solutions where these data points and these insights can help a lot to judge whether they should be doing this or not.
That's right. MasterCard has some terrific data available to help in this fraud space here. I had a call with them yesterday.
Did you? I hope they extended your credit a little bit further.
I'll take it in.
So, John, are you just working in the US market?
No, Aegis has been global for many years.
What are the differences?
Here's the interesting thing, though. The 2 million brands that are doing messaging in the US market come from 180 countries. So we have to be able to identify businesses from just about every country in the world.
So what are the main challenges with doing that?
Data sources, you know, different, like Canada is a nightmare because they have so many different provincial versus federal business IDs, and certain ones they don't share through any kind of APIs, and so which ID do you get from which company and what industry they're in might determine which type of ID they have. So that Canada's a nightmare, quite honestly. We've operated there for 10 years, but. Yeah, different countries have different, and if you really want to do this right, you're using authoritative sources, which means if we're verifying that you legally exist in the country that you're from, we're using government databases to do that. And so that's where it gets tricky. Sometimes they're just not automatically available, and if we're trying to do this in 3 seconds, we have to have processes that kick out to an analyst that can go figure out, okay, this didn't run automatically, we got to get this fixed. And that happens less than 1% of the time, but you can't say no to somebody because you can't find them. You have to be able to prove they exist or they don't exist. So you've got to have operational backup. That's the challenge.
And the same question for you, Marco. What are the international challenges with verifying numbers in different regions?
First thing that you have to have is phone number intelligence data globally, right? And that is something that netnumber has collected over like the last 15 years. Like we can identify the carrier of every phone number globally. Like there are about 10 billion, 9 billion like mobile, 1 billion landline. And that's the first step, right? To know like who has the actual authority given by the respective government to operate or to assign that phone number. And from there on you can make other steps, right? Like where do they have they made that phone number to be a virtual number? To whom have they assigned that? Who is currently the service provider on it? And you have to collect that on a global level. And that's quite an effort. And then you also have to consider that if you do that, and you collect all of that data, like they don't come in the same data formats. So you really have to have a technology platform that can digest hundreds of data sets and combine them and create the response that is relevant for that specific party that is asking, oh, I have a decision to make on that phone number. Should I terminate that? Should I blacklist that? Should I whitelist that? Is there some scrutiny around? Should I allow that transaction on the credit card or something like this? Or if there's online transaction? And that a lot of work was put into this. But I think there is also more to come in the future for this.
So Mike, while we're on this question of sort of regional rollout, what's next for the registry, for the MEF registry, and what would make a particular country, a candidate for expansion?
Well, we've been talking to a number of different territories for a number of years.
Yeah.
It's interesting and frustrating because I think sometimes when we talk to regulators, that in the hope that can move things along quickly, it's actually delayed us. Where we've been a little bit more bullish and said, right, we're just going to launch, and we might not have all the carriers, we might not have all the aggregators, but we'll launch and build it and they'll come. We've probably been more successful than actually trying to work directly with the regulators. I think it's important, looking at the factors. Firstly, the sort of registry that we have is very much focused on dynamic headers, rather than using just numbers. So that's what our solution kind of leads to. So that's the first question: is it a territory that supports that? Secondly, I think we need to make sure we've got some customers. So we've found that talking to some of the trade bodies of the financial trade bodies, the banking organisations, get together a few banks, a few customers that are likely to want to use this. That's also important. The carriers usually are more supportive, and I have to say, because they're in the room, the aggregators. The aggregators do most of the heavy lifting for this solution, and we've had fantastic responses. And the nice thing is that whenever we get very close to a new registry in a different territory, I can pick up the phone and speak to the major aggregators and say, we're thinking of launching there. Are you going to support it? And everybody says, yeah, of course, because they know what to expect now, and understand the benefits. So really, we're trying to cookie cut what we've got, because generally speaking the problems are similar all over the world, and whilst it is, I suppose, a bit of a niche solution, we've taken the view that to disrupt the fraudsters, actually just targeting the most smished organisations or brand can make a huge difference.
Yeah.
So it's actually, we're looking at those most smished brands. If we can get those on board with the registry, then as far as consumers are concerned, that will have the biggest impact.
John, Mike talked earlier about some of the brands not thinking that they had a problem and not really engaging because they said it doesn't affect us. Do you have a similar experience in the US? Or do you find that there's good, they're receptive towards the solutions that you offer?
So what's interesting is that we have direct connects with many of the largest aggregators in the world for the channel that we operate in for the US. So they've already got millions of brands that want to do messaging, and they want to get on a channel that they know is moving towards being trusted. Don't get me wrong, we've found our problems across all of our ecosystems, but we've been very fast to address them. But no, I haven't faced that kind of a problem. Separately, what I want to say though is we talk about things like texture ID, and there's a very, very deep, diligent process around those banks. And that's a high-risk type of brand, if you will. It's high risk to the market it's in. And so we strongly believe that something like that does bring value, but we believe it should also partner with the fact that you want to get everybody that's doing A2P messaging registered, right? So we wouldn't necessarily say to stop, because we think the registry is a good thing. But we think that we should also add this extra ability for everybody else. And things like, we talked about the LEI earlier, was brought up. The LEI, the GLIFE, Global Legal Entity Identifier, which is an extremely arduous process of producing documents from your company's history, its registration, board minutes, justifying the CEO is actually the CEO. And from my perspective, that's great for banks, because they're operating in an extremely high-risk regulated environment. I spent 20 years in the banking industry myself at the second largest bank in the world. But this is about everybody that's messaging. And the reality is that the people that are doing the spam and phishing are small entities. And they're going to get in whatever channel you're not protecting. So unless you create some sort of requirement for entry into these channels with some sort of verification and trace back to who is that sender, you're never going to eliminate the problem. But I just wanted to reiterate, we do agree that there are certain channels or certain players within an industry that you do want to go through that really deep manual analysis, to be sure and justify. But you got to get kind of the whole solution, if you will, to stop places of entry. Right now what we're facing is there's multiple ways to do messaging in the US market. And we have different standards for how businesses can get on there. And we're slowly, making contact and working to get everyone to do the same level of diligence, if you will, and have the same, obstacles to entering. But at the same time, if we don't make it easy for Bob's Barbershop to get in, they're going to go to other channels entirely, and the carriers will lose out. So there's a balance. But
okay, we've got about 3.5 minutes left. So do we have a question from the audience?
Guess we talk too much.
Yeah. I'll ask one more quick question then, Marco. The last session talked about AI. How do you see new scary AI tools impacting your business?
Yeah. So one thing that I can't talk a lot about is how AI is impacting content, because that's something that in the content analysis, like fighting AI, we're not taking a part in. But something that I can say is that, to Google's point earlier, like if you know for each and every sender ID that is allowed, who is in principle in charge of this, right? You can extend that model and say that person or that company, that brand, can even communicate to me what he wants to do on that phone number. And once you have that and you store that alongside the phone number, like I don't see how AI can outwit that intense data set, right? So you know from whom it's coming and you know what intention they have on that communication channel. I see AI is going to have a hard time to crack that down, right? But it's really important that the ecosystems understand that you can do that. You can register each and every business sender ID, right? And once you have done that, and which is a tricky process because you need to vet them and it takes long, it's actually also possible to ask them to tell them what they want to do on that phone number, right? And there are examples out there in other networks that are actually doing that, right? So whilst, for example, Apple on iMessage has a very restrictive process of who is allowed to do that, and the use case is also very limited, WhatsApp does the other approach. Everybody can go there. They vet everybody. And everybody that wants to use the service also has to provide templates for business-initiated use cases. So whenever there is an outbound message from a business where the user hasn't done the first reach out, which is the majority of the fraud cases, it's the case. The business reaches out first. In those cases, businesses need to submit templates and say, this is what I want to do. I don't see why that can't be put into registry as well. And the campaign registry is one of the places where this is already being done.
Yep. Yeah. And URLs and everything else.
Yeah.
So in theory, we can use that data.
Well, that's pretty encouraging. So we'll leave it on that positive note, and I'll say thank you to Mike, Marco, and John. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.